Welcome to Plastisphere, the podcast on plastics, people, and the planet. Live, or almost live, from Busan, South Korea, where the negotiations towards the Global Plastics Treaty are going into the final phase now. And while we're waiting for news, what's going to happen, I have another event recording for you. It's the recording of the event on subsidies to plastic production that I moderated the other day. So without further ado, here's the recording. Enjoy. Hello everyone and a warm welcome. Thanks for joining us. We often hear people talk about turning off the plastic tap. But what we don't hear so much about is a special kind of tap, which is the subsidies tap. And in this event, we want to shed more light on this. The event is hosted by the Quaker United Nations Office and Eunomia Research and Consulting. And the two organizations have recently compiled a succession of reports under the heading of Plastic Money. The first edition of this report was released in August of this year. And today we're going to share with you the findings of phase 2 of this report, which was released just this week. My name is Anja Krieger. I'm the producer of a podcast on plastic pollution called Plastisphere. And I learned about the subsidies issue through a podcast interview I did with some of the experts here. So why do we have such a problem with plastics? Today we want to look at how subsidies to production come into play when we look at that. For quite a while, there was actually very little knowledge on how primary plastic polymers are actually subsidized around the world. And the report the experts will present today aims to start filling these data gaps. If we better understand how the money of taxpayers increases plastic production and pollution, that can be the basis for change in the system. I'll be your host and moderator for this event, and I will introduce our great set of speakers one by one. And that doesn't only include speakers from the Quakers United Nations Office and Eunomia, but also the IUCN, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. To give you a little preview of the next hour and a half, here's how we're planning to run things today. First, Sébastien Willemart, the Belgian attaché for foreign affairs, will start with opening remarks and give us an overview on the impact of subsidies on the global plastics economy. Then Ronald Steinblick from QUNO and Tanzir Chowdhury of Eunomia will present the findings of the phase 2 report, which is called Plastic Money, Turning Off the Subsidies Tap. And you can get your copy in the back. Get it while it's still available. Ron and Tanzir will detail what it would mean to remove subsidies on production and how that could affect market prices and consumers. Next, Alexander Harrington from the IUCN will analyze the role of trade disciplines within the proposed international legally binding instrument and explore intersections with the law of the WTO, the World Trade Organization. We also have Jeva Barschauskaite with us from the IISD, the International Institute for Sustainable Development. She will discuss how public financial flows can be aligned with the objectives of the Plastics Treaty and the potential role of subsidies in this agreement. And finally, after the input by our speakers, you'll have the opportunity to ask questions and make comments. Okay, so we'll start with considerations from Sébastien Willemart on subsidy removal within the INC process. Sébastien is an attaché for Belgium's Federal Directorate for Climate and the Environment. He combines expertise in the field of circular economy and water management, and his responsibilities include overseeing the green portfolio of Belgium's development finance institution. Sébastien, you have the floor.
Thank you, Reg. Thank you very much, and hello everyone. Thank you for having me, and thank you for working so hard hand in hand since a passionate discussion in INC2, where I communicated my country's commitment to make everything we could to fight the nonsense of incentivizing environmental destruction, but also where I could recognize that I was far from well equipped to do so. My understanding is that to cure any disease whose symptoms are visible, one must settle a diagnostic of their causes and act on them directly. Here, we see plastic pollution. We know that plastics and plastic products are made artificially cheap and abundant by the allocation of privileges to the producers up the value chain. We thus need to identify exactly how much plastic production is boosted by public money. We see a clear correlation between the volume of primary polymer plastic production and the volume of plastic pollution globally. The physical properties of the materials at this stage of the plastic's life cycle are one of the factors in the disposability of products, also its recyclability, and hence their likelihood to turn into environmental hazards. There is a need to hold relevant actors accountable for their responsibility in plastic pollution and to repurpose scarce resources to ensure the implementation of this instrument. We have spent days speaking about means of implementation. And here, I think that we can see that key findings by outstanding recent research reveal that the subsidies to plastic polymer production industry in the top 15 polymer producing countries are in the order of $45 billion annually. Imagine just a minute the sheer volume of resources that could be unleashed if economic instruments like those ones, like subsidies, were directed towards solutions instead of an ever-growing production. Regarding the provisions, I would like to just say something because I was asked to refer to consideration on subsidies removal within the INC process itself. Regarding the provisions, in my view, yeah, I'm just going to introduce why we did what we are doing. But the EU has been very strong on also with Belgium and other member states on having good provisions on subsidies. In my view, addressing plastic subsidies will allow to shift from short-term gains and sectoral power concentration with long-term costs incurred by society to a more fair distribution to sustainable competitive products and behavior, as well as long-term benefits for people and in general to the environment that we all depend on. So the EU proposal all along the INCs align with established terminology found in other agreements addressing subsidy practices and WTO jurisprudence, mandating the elimination of existing subsidies and prohibiting state parties from granting new subsidies covered under the provision. Here, yet again, we've reintroduced a provision saying that parties should take effective measures to reduce subsidies and fiscal incentives to plastic production that contributes to plastic pollution, and that parties should report such measures in their national plans and in their national reporting. In a world in which yesterday more than 100 countries committed to find ways to reduce the production of primary plastic polymers and to report on measures taken to ensure it, we find it encouraging that pioneering work allows to benchmark and define the contours of how the matters of subsidies can be characterized. That's where I'm coming to, the research part. Going on with my metaphor of the plastic pollution crisis as an illness that we must fight, we must be cautious about the potential negative impacts of the treatment itself. This is why being informed about the cost repercussions of phase-outs in consumer products are an important data to gather, and I understand that this is part of the work that has been set forward, and I thank the researchers for that. Finally, still going the metaphor, any health recovery can only be witnessed when indicators are turning green for a sufficient period of time. And this is why it would be very beneficial to undertake research on the probability of pollution reduction due to the elimination of harmful plastic production subsidies. Overall, my view is that there is no world where throwing more public money into polluting activities results in the greater good. That's actually as simple that my 6-year-old nephew, who will have to live through this choking crisis, by the way, gets it. Choosing to ignore it, unfortunately, leads to serving vested interest and is not the path which is deemed appropriate to pursue. For this reason, we praise your attempt to document the patterns of public support to production for the economic modeling and projections that are in the pipelines. I thank you, and I'm looking forward to hear other great speakers and remain available for the exchanges that will follow their presentation.
Thank you so much, Sebastian. Now we are going to hear from the researchers, Ronald Steenblik and Tanzia Chowdhury of Eunomia, what they have found out about plastic subsidies so far. They will present the Phase 2 report of plastic money, turning off the subsidies tab. A quick bio of both of them. Ronald Steenblik is a senior technical advisor to the Sustainable and Just Economic Systems program at the Quaker United Nations office in Geneva. He's an expert in identifying and estimating environmentally harmful subsidies, particularly particularly those related to fossil fuels and plastics. Ronald contributes pro bono to global subsidy reform efforts, and he previously worked at the OECD, where he led initiatives on fossil fuel subsidy reform, and he chaired G20 peer reviews. Tanzir Chowdhury is a principal economist at Eunomia Research and Consulting, which has offices in the UK, Belgium, USA, and New Zealand. He has over 20 years of experience in economic research, teaching, and consultancy. Tanzir is an expert on economic and environmental policies with a focus on various economic instruments, such as environmental taxes and environmentally harmful subsidies. And he is an expert in modeling the economic, environmental, and social impacts of policies. Tanzir and Ronald, we're curious to hear your findings.
Good morning, everybody. Good afternoon, actually. Thank you so much for coming here. I'll be giving a few introductory remarks on the broad scale of the report and what kind of things we're looking for. Then Tanzir will provide much more detail on the findings of the latest research. Just the origins of this, I don't need to remind you all here that it goes back to UNEA Resolution 514. When we started to work on this, especially one of my first questions was, well, we know that there are subsidies for the consumption of fossil fuels, and we're talking about an industry that's very energy intensive, which also uses fossil fuels as a feedstock. How big are these? Well, it turns out nobody had done this work before. To try to kick off interest in this and find out what we could do, we organized what's called a convening at the Rockefeller Center in Bellagio in March of this year. And actually there are several people who attended that, 3 people on the table itself, and some additional people in the audience, and basically tried to wrap our heads around this. Fortunately, that led to some funding to actually undertake this work. And in just before the Bangkok meeting of the expert groups, we came out with the first estimate, and this latest one is a revision of our estimates, going deeper and based on better data than we had available in August. We hope that this will lead to a third stage, which we go even deeper and do some more elaborate modeling. So when we speak of subsidies, a lot of people say, well, what do you mean by it? And probably the easiest definition is to borrow one from the International Energy Agency, which they use in talking about energy subsidies. But you can say this about anyone, that subsidies can be defined generally in terms of their effects as any government action that lowers the cost of production, raises the price received by producers, or lowers the price paid by consumers of a product or service. In short, subsidies encourage more production, consumption, or both than would otherwise take place in their absence. So, but informally, the way that when people speak of subsidies, especially in the trade community, we tend to look to the World Trade Organization's definition, and that's really focuses more on the mechanism. In other words, if it quacks like a duck, it walks like a duck, then it must be a duck. So in terms of, is the government providing a grant, loan, equity infusions, loan guarantees? Is it foregoing revenue? So is it providing some kind of tax break? Or is it providing goods or services at lower than the market value? Sometimes these are called goods or services in kind. And there has, or is there any kind of income or price support? And in the case of plastics, price support is really the biggest one. And in all cases, it's a subsidy if a benefit is conferred. So for example, if a government is providing a loan for a new facility, but it's at exactly the same conditions, years of payback, the interest rate, et cetera, as a company would get from a bank, then there's no subsidy involved. But usually, of course, there'd be no point of governments being involved in this unless they were offering concessional terms. Just getting used to it. Yeah, so sorry for the fine print on this, but basically to show you when we're talking about where are subsidies to production, we're focusing on downstream fossil fuel production. That's a whole different order of magnitude. It's a whole different set of subsidies that support production and refining. We're looking at basically at the moment between what on the backside of refining and then what benefits what's called polymerization plants. So the plants that take the chemicals and subject them to a lot of heat and pressure and eventually turn them into polymers. So basically two types of subsidies are related directly to fossil fuels. One is the chemical feedstocks. So the way those are made is, for example, in facilities called steam crackers. In the case of naphtha, which is a product that comes out of the refinery, and for a long time was considered relatively low value product. Well, it turns out that if you subject these generically called alkanes, so ethane, propane, butane, to a lot of heat and pressure, you can create what's called monomers. So a typical monomer would be called ethylene. And then that is a feedstock into the polymerization plants. So you go from ethylene to polyethylene. You're stringing these molecules together in these very large chain molecules. So when we look at the data, we see that in a lot of cases the prices for the feedstocks like ethane are governments may set the price for that at much below its actual market value. So the difference between the selling price and the market value we count as a subsidy. The same thing with the process energy. A lot of these polymerization plants and steam crackers use natural gas and electricity. Again, governments may be selling these at below the market price, and that difference between what they're actually paying for it and the market price is a subsidy. Of course, in addition, their governments are providing grants in some cases to help cover the capital costs of building these plants. Sometimes they're providing price rebates on the natural gas, for example, that they buy. In some countries, particularly the United States, you have local governments, so state and local governments providing tax breaks, holidays on taxes that they might otherwise pay, and so forth. So all of these add up to quite a lot of money. Most of what's in that 45 billion estimate is related to price subsidies. So let's see. Yeah. So I covered this slide, and now I'll turn over to Tanzir to talk about the latest research.
Good afternoon, everyone. Hope you're enjoying the presentation so far. So, as Ron was explaining about the different, how the different types of subsidies are provided, I'm going to talk a bit more about what we have modeled and how we have modeled these subsidies and what are the preliminary findings of the study. So, the types of subsidies we have tried to estimate are mainly two types of subsidies, the feedstock subsidies and process energy subsidies. And feedstock subsidies, as Ron was saying, that these are the lower price the farms or producers are paying for the inputs to their production. So all these monomers or even precursors to these monomers are being provided at a lower price. And the ones we have looked at, for example, are petroleum oil, all the monomers which are derived from those, natural gases and coals. So these are some of the feedstock subsidies we have looked at. And then in terms of the process energy subsidies, we have looked at the energy consumption going into both monomer production and polymer production. So how all these energy prices are being subsidized, which are being used in all these monomer plants and then finally in polymer plants. And we looked at all three different types of energies which are being used. So electricity, which is the and natural gas in many places, and then some of them also use heating oils or other various forms of oils. So what we have done is we have modeled a baseline scenario, which is how things are currently happening. And then we projected that baseline scenario from 2024 to 2050. And if business runs as usual, then how it would look like in 2024 and 2050. So that's our baseline scenario, where we have modeled removal of subsidies for 71 polymer producing countries, covering all 7 primary polymers, which are HDPE, LDPE, LLDPE, PP, PET, PVC, and PS. There are other forms of polymer as well, but these are the most common ones we see. And then in addition to modeling the baseline scenario or business as usual scenario, we have also modeled a full subsidy removal scenario. So just trying to understand the impact on production of polymers, as well as some impact on consumer prices of removing all these subsidies. So these are the main modeling which we have done. So just going through some of the results, what we have found. So first I'm gonna briefly show you what are the baseline total primary polymer production subsidies. So what we have estimated is in 2024, 43 billion US dollars are being provided as these 3 subsidies, feedstock and energy consumption subsidies for producing monomers and polymers. But this does not actually include a lot of other forms of subsidies if you consider some of those. So our estimate is around US $45 billion per year on total amount of subsidies which are being provided in polymer production. And then if you project it forward to 2050 based on consumption demand for polymers, and we have used a projection made by OECD looking at polymer demands, and based on that projection, what we can see is 2050, if nothing happens between now and 2050 and business carries on as usual, we could see this subsidy from 45 billion going up to 43 billion actually, without including all the other forms of support. So those, just the ones we have modeled, they can stack up to about 78 billions in 2050. So that's not a very small number, as we can all see. And then I'll compare these numbers with some of the other subsidies, known subsidies, in the next slide, but just looking at into a bit more detail on who are the countries, which countries are actually providing these subsidies. And the top graph is for Saudi Arabia. They are the ones who are providing the most amount of subsidies, and we had to actually put them in a separate graph because the amount provided by Saudi Arabia is so large that it makes the other ones minuscule, and you cannot really see them in the graph. So that's why we had to kind of take them to a different graph, not singling out Saudi Arabia in any way. But so what we have estimated for Saudi Arabia is in 2024, based on our current estimates, they provide about US $38 billions out of the 43 billion, as you can see. And then if we project that number out to 2050, like the one we have done for the all the countries. So they would provide about 64 billion out of the total 78 billion. So that's the number for Saudi Arabia. And then looking at some of the other countries, Iran, we found out to be providing the second highest level of subsidies in terms of the ones we have estimated, which is US dollar 2 billions in 2024, and then which goes up to about US dollar 4.5 billions in 2050. So that's kind of the picture of how subsidies are looking like in terms of currently, as well as projecting forward to 2050 under the business as usual scenario. Now, how do we put into context this 45 billion we have estimated? How does it compare with the other subsidies commonly known to all of you? So fossil fuel subsidies, which is the highest, and which goes up to 1 trillion per year in US dollars, and that is the highest level of subsidies. And then the second highest is agricultural subsidies, which is 610 billion. So there are quite a few other subsidies which are quite high, in higher magnitude than the ones we have estimated for primary polymer production, but our one falls somewhere around the marine capture fishery subsidies, which is estimated as $45 billion per year USD, and then non-energy mining subsidies, which is estimated at 40 billion. So our one falls somewhere in between those two. So that's not, of course, as large as the agriculture subsidies or fossil fuel subsidies by any means, but not a trivial amount as well. As you can see, $45 billion per year is quite big. So now looking at, that's the subsidies, but we also wanted to model polymer production and what is happening to polymer production at the baseline, how much we are producing right now and up to 2050 based on current projections. And then what we wanted to do is, as I said, we modeled a scenario of removing all these subsidies, and we wanted to see how polymer production would be impacted by removal of those subsidies. So if we're looking at the baseline scenario, what we can see is current polymer production in total around the whole world is about 305 million tons in 2024. And as if businesses continue as usual and the polymer demand stays pretty constant, which is constantly increasing in the current trend, then we could see that go up to about close to 600 million tons in 2050. And if you're thinking about which other countries then produce most of these, so China is the highest, which produces almost a third of that, so slightly over 100 million tons per year right now, and which goes up to 103 million tons per year, and which goes up to about 260, doubles in production in 2050. And then they produce all 7 of the main polymers we have modeled. And then close to China, about 40% of Chinese production, 40 million tons in the current terms, 2024, is produced by United States, and their production will go up to 67 million if business continues as usual and go up to 2050. And the main polymer product produced in the United States is PE, polyethylene. So now, once we model the baseline scenario, we have also looked at what would be the impact of removing all these subsidies. And then what we have modeled is basically if you remove the subsidies, which are currently lowering the price of production. So we have modeled that if the price of production goes up by that amount, that should drive down some of the demand. And how would the production and consumption that would go down as a result of removing all these subsidies? Again, the results are quite skewed for Saudi Arabia as opposed to all the other countries because they are the largest subsidy provider. So their production would go down immensely, and then they would see a 2.38 million tons of production reduction in 2024, and that would rise to 2.83 million tons in 2050. So that's quite a large production reduction from Saudi Arabia. From the amount they produce about 15 million or slightly lower than that currently. And then the second highest reduction will be observed for Iran, who was, as we have seen in the previous slide, who provide the second highest amount of subsidies. So reduction in production would also be quite large for them, but it's nothing compared to Saudi Arabia. It's about 10 times less than Saudi Arabia, and it's 0.22 million tons per year in 2024, and that will go up to 0.27 million tons in 2050. And then the largest decrease Iran will see is basically HDP, LDP, LLDP, and PP. These are the ones they produce mostly. And moving on to the final results we have also looked at is now there are a lot of arguments that, if we remove all these subsidies, price of polymers would go up. That would affect the consumers because these polymers which are used in producing some of these consumer goods, like a plastic bottle, for example, or a cell phone, or a refrigerator, or a flooring, or agricultural plastics, all these things which contains all these polymers are then converted into different plastic products, which are then consumed by these consumers. So the argument is if these prices of polymer goes up by a significant amount, and the consumers, what are the effect on the consumers? So that's what we wanted to also check, that will the consumers be affected quite largely? Will they suffer a massive price increase and reduction in their welfare? But it turns out because the cost of polymer in the overall product price is so small, the effect overall is actually quite small on the consumers. So we have looked at so what we wanted to do is compare a different set of products in different sectors like packaging, clothing, flooring, agriculture. We have covered a varied number of products in different regions around the world to see how the average product prices for the final product and how much of that is actually coming from the polymers, what fraction of that is polymer prices. And based on that, what we have seen is the highest amount of impact would be faced for products like agricultural mulch film, which is actually the large fraction of that is actually polymers. The product itself is a plastic. It's a plastic film to cover your crops. And then the other products, the impact is really small. Now, none of them even have more than 1%. So vinyl flooring is the second highest impact, which is 1.53%. The rest of the product are the same. Really small impact. So as you can see, the overall impact on the consumers is not going to be large. And the argument that consumers will suffer if we take out these subsidies does not actually hold up. So we cannot blame it on the consumers and think of their welfare and say that we should not be removing these subsidies. So these are the things we have done so far in the phase 2 of this study. Some caveats, of course, that the data we wanted to include to model all of these subsidies often are not very easy to find. And subsidy rates, so for example, what we have done for the energy price subsidies, so subsidy rates were estimated using the average energy consumption for all industry. In reality, it might be actually slightly more subsidized. The petrochemical industries are often more subsidized compared to some of the other industries. And then, so in that case, our subsidy estimate might be actually an underestimate. The other thing is, as I said, not all form of government supports where we were able to include. So which basically means the amount of subsidies we have estimated is likely to be an underestimation. So if we can model all the other form of government supports which we are provided currently, the amount of 45 billion might even go up further than that. Now, just to close my session, so the next steps in terms of we are hoping to continue this work because we see that this is a very important piece of work and there's not much research has been done on this. So we want to continue to look at some additional scenarios. So what we have done so far, as I said, is just modeled one baseline scenario and one scenario for removal of all the subsidies. So we want to model some additional scenarios of partial removal of these subsidies and model some potential exemptions for some countries, say developing countries or some of the other countries who might not produce that much. So these are some of the scenarios we would like to model in the next phase of the research. Then we haven't really able to model any of the environmental impacts. So we just model the impact, the economic impacts, so impacts on production itself, and we have modeled impact on consumers, but we have not modeled any environmental impact, like what is the potential reduction in plastic pollution as a result of removal of these subsidies, or what is the resulting GHG emission reduction as a result of these removal of these subsidies. So these are some of the environmental impacts we want to model. We also want to, there's an interesting question came up in some of the discussions, is has anyone looked at the relationships between level of PPP subsidies which are being provided and price of polymers, the global or regional prices of polymers? So that is an interesting piece of econometric research. We are hoping to get some data, and so we want to kind of look at the relationship. If subsidies are increased, does it actually affect polymer prices as we have assumed? So we want to examine that relationship a bit further. And then the other thing we want to do is we have, in our first phase report, we have presented some country profiles. We have not done that in this phase, so you can look at the first phase of report, but we want to produce some additional country profiles in the next phase if we continue. So I think that's all from me. Thank you, everyone. Hope you enjoyed the presentation so far.
Thank you so much, Tanzir and Ronald, for these enlightening insights and also for all your hard work into shedding light on this. Now we have Alexandra Harrington, who will give us a short input on trade issues within the International Legally Binding Instrument, the ILBI. Dr. Alexandra R. Harrington is a lecturer in law at Lancaster University and the chair of the IUCN World Commission on Environmental Law's Agreement on Plastic Pollution Task Force. That was a mouthful.
It is. Combined with my name, it's already a mouthful, yeah.
Is there a short name for this long?
No, but we really should create one. Oh, thank you. This is my new challenge now after INC. Thank you.
Alexandra, you're an expert in international law, international organizations, environmental law, pollution law, just transitions and global governments, as well as trade law and financial instrument regulations. And we're all ears for your input.
Supposedly I am one, yeah. I don't know about that. Anyway, thank
You're
you.
not? Which one?
I'm kidding. It was a joke. Anyway, thank you all for being here today. We're really grateful to have this chance to speak to so many of you, especially as we're wrapping up this week here. It really is quite nice to have so many people here to talk about the issue of subsidies and also the issue of trade as well. And I also would like to thank Eunomia and QUNO for the hospitality in inviting me to speak, but also to be part of this report. Thank you very much. So what we're going to do today is have a bit of a historical discussion and a bit of this is where we currently stand as of nearly 1 o'clock on Friday discussion, realizing that over the course of the next several days, this may change, right? So the inclusion of subsidies, the inclusion of trade in the ILBI, the International Legally Binding Instrument on Plastic Pollution, we call it ILBI because we can at least have an acronym for that, is something that is very much up in the air. And what is in my very small portion of the report in the one box gives a bit of a history as to where this came from, where the idea of subsidies came from, how they have been included since the beginning of the INC process, and especially since we had textual developments for the various INCs. So INC3, which was last year in Nairobi, then INC4 this year in Ottawa, and obviously now INC5 here in Busan. To give a sense of what we are looking at coming into today, many of you will be familiar with the idea that at the beginning of this week, we had the decision to use the chair's non-paper as the negotiating document, with the option of opening it up to any additional textual proposals from various state parties. We have seen a number of them. We have seen a number of them that reflect in many ways provisions that were in the compilation document, which was, for those of you who have not been exposed, 77 pages of very heavily bracketed text, which came out of Ottawa, and hence the decision to have something a bit more condensed coming from the chair as his non-paper suggestion to move the negotiations forward. So briefly to point out where both subsidies and trade were present in the compilation document and are currently present in the non-paper, as well as some aspects of what has gone on over the past several days to frame the scientific and economic and technical discussions that we're having here. I think it's very important to highlight that subsidies were included in the compilation document. And not to have a spoiler, but several slides from now, you will see that they were not specifically referenced in the non-paper. So there is a gap. There is a certain gap, and there were areas where there were not as many gaps, but this certainly is one where we have seen a great number of gaps. And what was interesting for many of us who were also not only in the INC processes, but also in Bangkok, so during the intersessional working period, where subsidies technically were a potential element of the agenda, is that they did not come up for discussion to any great deal in Bangkok. The focus really was on the idea of financing mechanisms, et cetera, which are currently being discussed and debated heavily, but not on subsidies. So that, I think, does give us a sense of the understanding that, yes, these were in the compilation document, they have been discussed, but the financial priorities amongst member states tend to be much more, in the limited time that we have, focused at the moment on financial mechanisms. It doesn't, of course, mean that subsidies are not important. And so we have seen EU, we have seen New Zealand, we have seen champions proposing as we get, I'll just get ahead of my slides now, as we get to the past several days of negotiations and intensive work, we have seen proposals to put these back in, to put references to subsidies back in several places in the non-paper. So we will see what the ultimate result is. But I think it's important to highlight that when we looked at the compilation document, there were a number of different areas. So primarily in part 2, which is the idea of the control measures and potentially binding as well as voluntary control measures, we had subsidies. We also had elements on transparency and tracking, which are, again, not necessarily reflected in the non-paper, but we did have references which would largely have been under reporting and in conjunction with one of the proposed annexes as well. So subsidies, I think it's important to be remembered, not only will potentially, if depending on the outcome, play a role in the treaty itself, but also will potentially play a very important role in the development of the annexes as we move forward and as we think about the future COPs, conferences of the parties. I apologize, we all use these acronyms very frequently, but we really do need to kind of explain them. These will be potentially developed much further, so this discussion will not end in terms of subsidies, will not end with Busan or with the ultimate outcome of the ILBI process. As I mentioned, again, in the non-paper, this was not a present reference. However, at the moment, it currently still is being up for debate. Whether or not we will see it in subsequent iterations over the next several days, we shall see. The other thing I wanted to highlight here quickly before turning to trade is the question about intersection with WTO laws. So World Trade Organization laws per se have been referenced a great deal in the past several INC processes. And we have heard many states raise concerns about how there would be potential intersections and regime convergence with the future ILBI and the WTO. So just to point out that there are certainly, especially in the context of subsidies where we have an entire agreement on subsidies and countervailing measures, there are existing WTO laws that do relate to trade and subsidies. However, this does not necessarily mean that we would be foreclosed at all from including this language in the treaty. It is not uncommon to do so, and indeed, as long as it's written in a way that is complementary, would not be in any way prohibited under international law. These are all elements of the SCM. For time, I will not go over them, but I am happy to review them with anyone if they have questions. And to get quickly to trade, I think it's important to highlight here that trade, again, was very much present in the compilation document. There was indeed an entire article that focused on trade. It was historically part 2.10 and had both import and export restrictions, provisions, licensing requirements, etc. That was removed and condensed into a much smaller element in the non-paper. But this was something that really was quite critical, and we had several options for how this would be done. We had several options for what this type of restriction might look like, and how it would work, but indeed it was present. And so I think it's important to remember when we are linking to subsidies and we're also linking to issues of trade, which inherently the entire report basically does, that this is something that could be an important element still in the ILBI. As we think of again, there are a number of other areas where it was tangential, but for the interest of time, I will not get into all of them. When we get to the non-paper, the article itself was removed. There is, however, or there was, as it was forwarded in the beginning of the week, a reference to trade in the preamble. There were certainly some elements, voluntary elements in Article 16 as proposed, and Article 17 as well. And we have seen textual proposals coming in from several countries on trade, some to promote the use of trade in the treaty, some also to negate the use of trade in the treaty or restrict the use of trade terms in the treaty. So it is still very much something that is up for grabs. If it is included at all, it is something that will be, I think, very important to take into consideration from an international law perspective when we think about things like subsidies in addition. And again, to highlight that if we are looking at World Trade Organization laws and rules, we do think about perhaps clearly trade, hence the name of the organization. But again, there is nothing in the existing structure that would cause a direct conflict or even necessarily an indirect conflict with the regulation of plastics, as we have seen in many other environmental law regimes as well, as long as there's trade restrictions and trade licensing agreements, et cetera, requirements were written in a way that did not directly cause a conflict. And certainly many of the proposals that were offered in the compilation document and that we have seen this week would be in compliance, which always makes my law professor heart very, very happy. So with that, I believe I am just at my 10-minute mark. Again, there are several other potentially interesting areas to think about that have been raised in the context of WTO and trade and the Plastics Treaty, the ILBI, including the question of dispute settlement, which was raised early on in the compilation discussions in terms of whether or not the appropriate venue would actually be the World Trade Organization rather than the ILBI for any compliance issues. That has largely been kind of dropped from the discussion at this point, but it is there. And I know Ron found this particularly interesting at one point. He's trying to remember when, but at one point you did, because we had a conversation about the fact that this has never really been an issue. And in fact, it would be, under the laws and the rules of the WTO itself, it would be essentially illegal and impossible for there to be a claim brought under another treaty regime that was not also brought under an existing WTO agreement. So I think that is something that we should also be aware of as we're looking forward into the potential futures, many of them as they may be, of the ILBI. And with that, I shall finish and turn back over to Anja for our next introduction. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alexandra, for this very important context and introducing us into how this relates to what we're doing here.
We hope.
Great. Now we take a look at public financial flows and subsidy roles in supporting treaty objectives with Eva Warszawskaite. Eva is a senior policy advisor at the International Institute of Sustainable Development, IISD, in Geneva, working on sustainable trade issues, including plastics. She has worked on a broad range of issues relating to the international economy, trade, sustainability, the environment, and energy. Eva, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Anja, and it's a pleasure to speak after so much interesting data has already been produced. So what I will try to look into the questions of why. Why do we need to look at the public financial flows? Why do we need to do that subsidy supervision that the previous speakers have been talking about? And I'll mention a little bit about what the precedents are. What do we already have in this area that can help us think through this issue during the next couple of days or so and make sense following the existing precedents. So let me start with why. And when we talk about the alignment of public financial flows with the purposes of these instruments, we have two types of needs. We have internal needs of governments and their budgets, and we have external needs of actually supporting the implementation of the new instruments, right? Let's start with the internal needs. As Ron and Tanzir mentioned before, subsidies for plastic production artificially lower the price of plastics as well as plastic products and increase the production and consumption levels. That also means that investing the public finance into plastic producing industry increases the production of plastics and creates more additional costs for public budgets, because we are creating additional waste management and recycling needs of the populations that are living in the same jurisdictions where those plastics are produced. There are also more costs that are associated to health impacts, to the proliferation of microplastics in the things that we eat, in the things we consume. The money that we spend on plastic subsidies could actually otherwise support research and innovation, say alternatives, say the new plastics recycling technologies, new waste management technologies. We could invest into education or reskilling of the workers that work currently in plastic industries. Again, those industries are big, and those people will need to move away from those industries. So, and those resources domestically are not available in the governments that are spending more money on plastic subsidies and other tax incentives that are going to the plastic industry. Now, speaking about external needs, we need to learn the lessons from COP29. We all have seen what has happened in Baku in Azerbaijan. The developing countries saw only 300 billion a year by 2035 to support their efforts to deal with climate change, and it was quite disappointing for a few of them. That says that the sufficient amount of financing for treaty implementation is really not guaranteed because the budgets worldwide are not growing. If anything, they are decreasing, and the development aid is decreasing as well. We have seen that in almost all major donors, from the United States to Germany to UK to France. This is a trend. This is not a temporary dip. I do not think that it is realistic to see those budgets going exponentially, and this is why expecting a lot of new money going into a new financing mechanism will be very, very difficult, because no governments will find the new money to go there. So now that we kind of covered the whys, let's also think about what has already been done in our existing instruments. Because this issue does not exist in vacuum. I just mentioned Paris. And we need to remember that already Kyoto Protocol indicated that developed country parties should implement progressive reduction or phasing out of market imperfections, fiscal incentives, tax and duty exemptions, and subsidies in all greenhouse gas emitting sectors that run counter the objective of convention. When we look at Paris Agreement, it also obliges parties to make financial flows consistent with a pathway towards low greenhouse gas emissions and climate resilient development. We also have Kunming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, which includes Target 18, which aims to identify by 2025, eliminate, phase out, or reform incentives, including subsidies, that are harmful for the biodiversity. And we need to also think about the recent WTO agreement on fisheries subsidies. Even if in phase 1 it already agreed to remove the most harmful types of subsidies, those that are being provided to illegal, unregulated, and unreported fishing, as well as those that are provided to overfish stocks. And it's not difficult to see why, when discussing environmentally harmful subsidies and fisheries and plastic go hand in hand. We're thinking about public finance that is spent on the damage done to global public goods. And that, in the end, incentivizes more public spending to repair the very same damage done. So what does that alignment means in the end, right? Because we always have two sides of that coin. We have one side that clearly says that we need to phase down the public financial flows that are supporting activities that are incompatible with the objectives of a new treaty. And that will demand all governments to have a look exactly what their spending is, whether they have subsidies or incentives, create inventories, and think about which of those subsidies are incompatible with this instrument. I think we just heard previously about quite a few approaches that could be useful for governments, guiding their thinking about them. There's also an important need to think about what alignment means in terms of increase of public or even private financial flows towards activities that will need to support the treaty implementation. And in this perspective, we have also heard about the incentivizing the private financing, the incentives such as plastic fee towards the support of financing mechanisms of this treaty. I think I'm running out of time, but I'm really happy to answer any questions, and I'm really pleased to have been invited to join this excellent panel. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Eva. We're also very pleased that you're here on our event. This was our input. Thank you very much again to all of our experts and guests. We now have 30 minutes for a Q&A, so if you'd like to follow up on anything that was said, if you have comments or questions, just raise your hand and somebody will bring you the microphone. Hello? There's no light, so I'm like, I don't know if it's on. Hi everyone, my name is Isabel Jarrett from the Pew Charitable Trust. Thank you so much for this excellent set of presentations and a dive into a topic that it's a bit of a pet topic of mine. I'm really pleased to see this work take shape and take form. So thank you all. I just had a couple of questions. It would be really interesting to hear from Ron and from Tanzir about if they were surprised by any of the results that they found in the research. I was personally a bit surprised by some of the numbers for China, and I didn't see the US. The US is kind of capturing the rest of the world. So that was just what stood out to me. And I'd also be interested to hear a little bit more about your thoughts on price support and whether that came up in any of and how different governments provide this, and whether that came up in kind of your research and kind of any additional thoughts that you provide on that. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll answer what I can briefly and then pass it to Tanzir. Yes, in terms of, for example, the United States, as I mentioned, there are a lot of local tax breaks, particularly in states like Louisiana. There was a huge plant built recently in Pennsylvania that benefited from it was the biggest industrial project in the state of Pennsylvania since the Second World War. They have, in addition to all these various local tax breaks, they have basically a rebate on any natural gas that's used if it's been produced in the state of Pennsylvania. So there are a lot of these. We hadn't analyzed this systematically, so that's what we hope to be able to do in phase 3. So what was in the modeling was really more on the price side. But yeah, this is one thing that we're appealing for help from people who actually know the situation in their countries. If they could contact us and point us to where we might find additional information. There are a lot of, we find out about these subsidies all the time, but we really need to do this more systematically.
Thanks, Ron. You have answered most of the questions. So what I would just add to that is, so the types of subsidies we have modeled, these are basically the feedstock and the energy prices, because that's what the data we found. And even in that one, what we have, basically how we have estimated it, it's all detailed in the full paper if you want to go and read. But it's basically the price the producers faces and then the cost of supplying that. We just taken the difference, and if that difference is negative, which means the producers are paying a lower price than the cost of producing the energy or cost of producing the feedstock, that's how we have estimated. Now, which basically means all the subsidies we have estimated is price subsidies, so we could not look at investment subsidies, for example, or cheap loans or interest-free loans which are provided. So those are the subsidies which might be actually visible in countries like China or US, where the production of polymer is the highest, but in terms of when we looked at the graph of the amount of subsidies are being provided, so they don't maybe provide price subsidies, but they provide a lot of these other subsidies, which we could not capture. So our hope is to capture some of these if we can do the phase 3 of the research and see how we can include some of these other types of subsidies, non-price subsidies in our analysis.
Thank you so much. I think there was one more. I'm sorry, I've lost a little track of the order.
He was.
Hi, thank you very much. I'm Bob Phillipson from GSCC. So thank you for the presentation. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. Yes. Really fascinating. So I've just been reading recently about, there's been really good reporting about an oversupply of capacity in plastics, particularly in China, which is actually causing a glut in the market and prices to be too low for European plastic producers to be able to compete, even leading to plastic plants in Germany and Europe having to close. So it seems to be an oversupply in the market. And yet, you've also got China still continues to create more plastic capacity. You've got India doing the same, you've got the US doing the same, Saudi investing in new production facilities in China. So, and now you're also saying that the prices that are there are also being kept even lower than the oversupply issue. So, I mean, what am I missing? Is it just me, or does this whole situation not kind of stack up? Does it make sense? I mean, there's also industry analysts, Wood Mackenzie, predicting that the growth of plastic is going to continue rising up and up and up without any reference to the Plastics Treaty or this oversupply issue. So, I mean, why does this situation not call more attention internationally, especially given these subsidies are coming from not a broad base of supply from lots of different countries? You're saying that, is it 38 billion out of the 43 billion, which is like 90%, are coming from one country? Why is this not a bigger issue internationally? What are we missing here? Thank you.
Well, your just brief answer is that nobody has provided the numbers before, really. I mean, here and there, but that's what we're trying to do, is explain. I mean, in terms of the overcapacity, I mean, part of it, for example, in Europe, they were hit by very high natural gas prices after the invasion of Ukraine, and so, I mean, I've definitely been seeing reports of some of the larger producers saying, we're looking at maybe selling off some of this, or maybe prematurely closing down the plants. So it's definitely having an effect, but disproportionately in different regions, depending on the extent to which they're paying full market price for their inputs.
If I may, thank you. Sarah Dunlop, Minderoo Foundation. I wanted to turn to Tansy and Ronald's estimate of 45 billion increasing to 78 billion by 2050. That is a real eye-opener for me, really important work, particularly in the context of the health costs that we've been working on. So in 2015, the health costs globally for producing plastic, from the particulate emissions, the gases, etc., was tenfold that. It was just under 600 billion. That was in 2015, US dollars. The costs for just 3 plastic chemicals, that's BPA and stroke, cardiovascular disease, phthalates and all-cause mortality, and flame retardants and IQ point loss, that was 675 billion just in US alone. So there's a complete disconnect here between the subsidizing of an industry which is harming human health. We're paying the price. So thank goodness we've got this now as a backdrop to sort of try and look at the equation and also look at the increasing production as the previous questioner asked. So I don't know if you wanted to comment on that, but we're actually looking further globally at these costs, and we'll be having a publication coming out in the next couple of weeks on that.
Yeah, thank you for that number, sir. That's real eye-opener. And as I say, we haven't actually modeled some of the environmental and maybe the other costs of to the society of all these overproduction due to provision of subsidies. So good thing would be to look at in the next phase of the research, if we actually can do that, is also alongside environmental impacts, we might actually be able to connect it to the negative health impacts as well of these subsidies. So if you remove subsidies, what would be the impact of reduction in production? And that number, if we can combine that with your research, and we can estimate that that could actually save up health costs by this amount, that would be another big number, which would be like a very big positive impact of removing some of these subsidies. So we'll look forward to that study, and hopefully we'll be able to use some of those numbers to estimate potential health impact savings of removal of subsidies in the phase 3 of this research.
Thank you so much for the question and for the answer, Tanzir. We have another question here. And then there's one over there. And then a third one over there. Okay, I see you all. 1, 2, 3.
Thank you very much. First, congratulations to the authors and QUNO and Eunomia for this. I fully agree with the point that the issue of subsidy has not been very much discussed in the environmental field. There have been a lot of claims and complaints, but not necessarily deep research. And also, in terms of context, the language usually in multilateral environmental processes is harmful incentives. And we have to recall that we already have a mandate, Global Biodiversity Framework, Goal 18, that we are supposed to reduce half $1 trillion in subsidies. They don't say which ones are those. They say harmful to biodiversity. They may include agriculture, forestry, water, potentially also fossil fuels and plastics, because have impacts on the environment. So we have a mandate that I think need to be fed, and not this type of research goes into the direction of, so let's not forget that. So that's the comment. Now I have a question and a legal point that perhaps worth it to explore. When doing the estimates, they look low to me, but perhaps it's lack of data, so highly probable. Did you consider investment, capitalization, and price strategies of state-owned enterprises. Look what I'm saying very carefully, because you have Saudi Arabia, Iran. I come from an oil-producing country, doesn't mean that I like that, but just to mean that the oil sector, refining, polymer, and petrochemical is vertically integrated in most of these countries. It's state-owned, usually don't have a price markup internally but externally. And thirdly, it's not necessarily considered a subsidy because it's not a grant from government to private sector, it's government to government. So usually not covered by normal definitions. Even on the effects, it's an issue because it depends on how you perceive that effect in the market. But this is a point that I wanted to make because you have obviously the WTO subsidies agreement, you may want to have developed rules in MEAs, but you also have the regulation on state-owned enterprise, Article 17 of the GATT. And I think that's another angle that many people have forgotten because it's very difficult to discipline state-owned enterprises, even on subsidies, because subsidies you regulate the public budget. But on the policies of state-owned enterprises, it's an indirect control scheme. So don't forget that, because I think there is a match there. I don't know if you have it in the data. I'm curious to see how you calculated that, because the numbers may change a lot in and out depending on how you do that. And thank you for the presentation.
Thanks a lot. Ron or Tanzia, a comment?
Yeah, just to confirm that we have not actually estimated that. So there are, we mentioned that in the report that there are a lot of vertical integration, but the data we had to bank on is basically the supply price, the difference between, as I said, the difference between the supply price and the cost of production, and that has kind of used as the amount of subsidies per ton and then multiplied it by the production to estimate the amount. So we could not use that, but maybe phase 3 research, we can look into this and then see if we can get a bit more estimate on that.
Just very briefly, in some cases, actually, though, the governments, where there's a mix of private and state-owned enterprises, they do have a published, they do have a set price. But what you're really talking about is transfer pricing. So in governments with less transparency and where it's really only basically the state-owned enterprise, that's where it becomes difficult. I would just say also is that they're on regarding financing, there are good data out there on multilateral bank financing and export credit financing, but what has not been yet collected is just within countries, like say from national development banks to their own industries. And that we're hoping, there's an organization called Oil Change International. They've said they want to start getting into that, and that may provide some additional data.
I think this is working. I think. If not, you can yell at me, David. First of all, thank you for the question and the point, and somebody else who reads the treaties the way I do. Thank you. I appreciate it. I think just 2 quick points. First of all, you raised a very critical issue in terms of the convergence, and the convergence of all of these different treaties that we have together, as well as soft law requirements like under the GPF, that have multiple impacts, including from plastic pollution. And the need to keep this present in the treaty and also in the way that we implement it, the way that it works in COPs, the idea of having international coordination and cooperation between the secretariats and the COP bodies themselves, so we can keep all of this type of information going back and forth and not just have it be siloed and then have no one know, because that's the worst possible outcome for everyone. So I think that's really point number 1. And then point number 2, I think we also now see why it is important to have, if we can, a treaty that has subsidies references directly in the treaty, at least in the preamble, if not more, so that we can then create those type of nexuses and explain why, and not have to be dependent on future COPs making decisions based on what we understand at the time, but what we know now. So thank you very much. It makes me so happy when people see those connections.
Super interesting question, and your answer, Alexander. Yeah, there's somebody waiting over there with the next question.
Thank you very much.
Someone else there.
I have a specific question. I was interested in the comparison between subsidies on different sectors. Could you please precise, when you speak of water, exactly what was the kind of subsidies which were mentioned underwater? Because we are interested to compare what is helped on water issues, especially tap water issues, and on plastic issues. I don't know if you...
Just a quick question. Would you quickly just tell us who you are, who you're with?
Yes, I'm Muriel Papin from a French NGO called No Plastic in by Sea, and we work mainly on plastic bottles issues and tap water issues, and the link between.
Thank you so much. Who wants to take this question?
Can you repeat your question?
Oh, could you just give us like a very short summary again of your question?
Yeah, there was the graph with a comparison between subsidies on agricultural, plastic, and water and other kind of sectors. If we can see again the graph, and if you can precise exactly what kinds of subsidies you mentioned when you speak of subsidies on water. Is it tap water services? Is it other things? That's the question I have. Specific question.
Yes, so this is actually a study that I co-authored. That is mainly the underpricing of water in some places, but a large part of it is irrigation. And basically the cost of the difference between what's actually costs the governments to provide the water and what revenues they're getting to cover those costs. It comes from the World Bank, the water estimate.
Maybe we can also follow up on that after the event. We have another question right next.
Thank you so much. So my name is Alima Kwate with IUCN, based in Senegal. I have two questions. The first one is for Dr. Arrington. Do you think at this late stage of the negotiations, we can hope to have some provisions on subsidies in the treaty? And the second question is for Tanzir. I was wondering if you had a look at the impact of removing subsidies on the competitiveness of the recycled materials, because I don't know for other regions, but in my regions, recyclers are facing these challenges of selling the recycled materials at a competitive price compared to the virgin materials. So I was wondering in your study if you had a look at that or if you plan to do so. Thank you.
So thank you, Alima. And Alima, really, the Dr. Harrington is not necessary. We work with each other every day. We email each other every day. I like to hope, right? So I hold out hope that there is a chance for this to stay in, or for at least there to be enough of a reference, even if it is only in the preamble, even if it is only a small hook, there's enough of a hook that we can keep it in for current and also for future implementation, so that we can build on it in the COP processes, in decision-making, in reporting, review, etc. So I do still have hope. I think we are still way too far away from the end to give up hope yet. But I've been accused of being a silver lining person, so there's that. Thank you.
You've raised a very good point that one of the primary things we do want to do is not only reduce consumption of plastic, but where possible, substitute these with other materials as well as recycled materials, because we have put a lot of plastic in the market, and what we do want to do is, at the end of their life, then we do want to recycle them. And currently, the market is not in favor of them. So the price of recycled plastic is a lot higher than price of primary plastic. And one of the reasons is actually price of plastic, primary plastic is low because of subsidies. That's one of the reasons. There are a lot of other reasons, but so we have not looked at that impact, but that is something definitely we are interested in, that if that price reduction in primary product is enough to actually trigger a more suitable or favorable market for recycled plastic. So that is something definitely is a good point to look at in future. We haven't looked at it at this phase.
Thank you. We can take one more question. Anyone?
Sorry, it's not really a question. I was just going to point out a couple of takeaways from my point of view. It's Joe Papanescu from Eunomia, one of Tanzi's colleagues. Just a couple of things. I think one is the sort of big message here is that there's enough evidence from scratching the surface of this issue that there's enough, that it's not trivial at the very kind of low end of the probable range. It's something worth really considering, but more research, everything that we've talked about in terms of additional research is likely to push those numbers up, some of them maybe very considerably. So this is really just putting it on the table as it's at least big enough to be seriously worth considering and including. And then just on something that no one's asked questions on, but I would just point out, absolutely not intending to say Tanzi forgot to mention something. He definitely didn't, but when we were looking at those potential inflationary impacts, those two products which are potentially above 1% in terms of effectively retail price increase, they're both primarily B2B markets. So actually the impact on true consumers is going to be much smaller. So we don't actually, in terms of true consumer prices, we probably don't really have anything which approaches anywhere near 1% in terms of inflationary impact. And that will be one of the arguments being made against this type of measure. So just thought I would point that out.
Thanks for pointing that out. We're coming to the end of our session. Oh, Ron would like to just quickly comment that.
No, just to point out, even at $45 billion a year, that's very close to the estimate for global fishery subsidies, and there is an international agreement to limit fishery subsidies.
Great. With this, we're coming to the end of our event. A huge thank you to the panelists. Maybe we'll give them another hand. And to all of you in the audience for taking time out of this super busy schedule of this meeting to listen and engage, and for these excellent questions. It's really great to see the level of interest in this important work, and we will be sharing a recording of this event for your future reference, or if you would like to share it with interested colleagues. And if you asked a question, if you were among the question askers and you do not want to have this included in the published recording, please go to Andres, who's sitting here right by the microphone, and let him know. And then he'll write that down. Great, so hope everyone has a great rest of their day, and thanks for joining us.
Everyone in the exit, the Korean Board of Tourism has kindly offered some souvenirs, so please help yourself on the way out. I apologize for a little bit of plastic wrapping in one of them. We asked for it not to be, but please help yourself.
You don't know how to carry that.